12 days after the lights went out, Jana still woke at dawn with a tightness in her chest. The morning hush that replaced the familiar hum of machines and occasional street noise struck her with equal parts awe and dread. She could almost pretend nature had reclaimed the world in a single, decisive sweep until she remembered how it had happened. What remained of her family's meager rations clinked in her canvas bag. Each jostled was a reminder that at one time there had been refrigerators to keep things fresh, stoves to cook on, and microwaves for quick meals. All were now as silent and useless as the blackened laptops and shattered tablets that once defined daily life. She pressed her fingertips against her temple, recalling the surging waves of solar radiation tearing through satellites, cell towers, and power grids. Overnight, everything with circuitry had fried, the delicate innards of every electronic rendered inert. In a ghastly stroke of cosmic luck, a perfectly timed solar flare cascade had severed humanity's digital lifeline. She closed her eyes, drifting back to the moment she had seen the skies crash with hues of violet and gold. News alerts on her phone had been dire, but no one truly believed that something so unstoppable would occur in their lifetime. The world at large had treated it like another sensational headline, floating in the ephemeral space of social media. Some took it more seriously. Scientists, doomsday preppers, and a scattering of officials who tried to alert the public. Still, most of civilization had been caught off guard when the electromagnetic storms burned out entire networks. Buildings across the city lost power in an instant. Hospitals relied on backup generators for only a few hours before those too succumbed. Planes vanished from skies, their navigation systems going dead. Cars with advanced electronics rolled to a halt on highways, forming labyrinthine barricades of twisted metal. There was a reluctance among survivors during the first few days to accept the finality of it all. Some clung to the dead weight of their phones, waiting for them to resurrect. Others hoarded small engines or tried linking batteries in increasingly desperate attempts to spark life into useless devices. Jana had recognized early on that these gestures were likely an exercise in futility. She remembered standing in her apartment in the aftermath, rummaging through her cupboards for anything edible or purifiable. She'd navigated the unlit stairways down 8 flights, carrying only what she could stuff into 2 backpacks. Moments later, she blended into throngs of neighbors who, like her, had realized the city's resources would not last long. On a brisk morning, she found a traveling companion named Henry. He was a wiry, bespectacled man in his early 30s who had worked at a local library. Somehow he seemed calm amid the chaos, and Jana latched onto his composure as if it were a life raft in churning seas. By day's end, they had exited the city, weaving between defunct cars, overflowing sewers, and panicked clusters of people who had not yet conceived of leaving. It was the type of decision that forever changed Jana's life. A single choice that carried her away from the worst of the rioting, but also separated her irrevocably from the few friends and haunts she knew. She consoled herself with the hope that any large survivors' camp outside the city might provide a starting point. If not for normalcy, then at least for a community of sorts. Henry had heard rumors of an old farmland region near a reservoir that had organized a settlement. There, families had banded together to share resources and knowledge. With little else to guide them, the two trudged onward. After days of hunger, thirst, and marauding strangers, Jana and Henry arrived at a sign on the outskirts of the rumored settlement. The paint-chipped words, County Road 14, were barely visible in the dim twilight. They passed rows of tall grass and half-collapsed barns as they approached the settlement. Lantern light flickered among the camp's scattered tents, reflecting off a scant few solar panels laid out in open fields. A weather-beaten man named Alejandro greeted them, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Eyes hardened by exhaustion, he nonetheless nodded them a welcome. He led them through a makeshift gate made of wire mesh and scrap wood. Little enclaves of survivors occupied old barns and newly constructed improvised shelters. Some had rigged up small stoves, powered by wood scraps, and others had a rotation of night watch volunteers. Jana and Henry soon learned that this was only a fraction of an emerging movement, as people from decimated or uninhabitable city centers scattered into rural areas across the nation. Alejandro introduced them to Danielle, the de facto leader of the settlement. Danielle was a middle-aged woman with a shaved head and olive-green jacket, a no-nonsense air about her that belied a warm, empathetic heart. She asked them about their skills. Jana admitted her background in data entry was virtually useless now. She was no farmer, no mechanic, but she offered manual labor in exchange for shelter. Henry's library experience might yield minor help. He had at least read widely in fields like basic mechanics, horticulture, and medicine, a swirl of book knowledge that might be put to practical use. Danielle heard them out, nodded, and instructed them to help gather resources in the woods. They would learn as they went, just like everyone else. As the settlement struggled to survive, stories circulated of the initial chaos, how rival groups had formed in more populated sectors, violently hoarding resources. Darkness expanded the bounds of fear at night. A council took shape within camp to plan for the future. Immediate tasks were building deeper wells, establishing permanent latrines, and securing farmland. Planning committees debated how to engineer rudimentary windmills or harness any leftover solar panels. A handful of survivors in the settlement had dabbled in electronics or engineering. They would gather by candlelight, flipping through battered textbooks pilfered from local libraries, and rummaging for intact equipment. Now and then someone proposed reassembling a generator from fragments of old tractor motors, though attempts were so far unsuccessful. Jana found comfort in the routine. Each morning she joined a group heading out to scavenge. They searched the outskirts for anything that might prove useful: seeds, livestock feed, working windmills, or even a few solar setups that had been shielded sufficiently to survive the worst brunt of the storm. She was often sent to old barns to collect tools. Though many of the electronics could not be salvaged, manual implements remained. It gave Jana a strange sense of hope, the idea that maybe they could pivot to a simpler existence, an impression that was quickly dashed by the endless sequence of challenges. The settlement's water supply was a major one. With no powered pumps, everything had to be drawn by hand or rigged up to mechanical systems. Food was sparse. Farmland had to be carefully managed. Seeds had to be rationed for future growing cycles. Livestock, if found, had to be cared for with near constant vigilance. In time, Jana began forging a kind of friendship with Henry. They spent late evenings around a campfire, discussing what once seemed mundane. A new phone upgrade, a favorite show. Now all that was irrelevant, replaced by the primal rhythms of sunrise and sunset. Henry had accepted that the world might never revert to its former state. He told Jana it was the chance for a fresh start, a complete do-overs, where humans were forced to reconnect with the land. Jana was not so sure. It was difficult to imagine the world's billions surviving such an abrupt shift. The global scale of the devastation weighed on her, and she questioned whether a new civilization, smaller, more sustainable, could truly emerge from these ashes. One evening, as Jana massaged her feet by the glow of a flickering lantern, Danielle dropped by their patch of shelter. The worry on her face brought a cold dread. She explained that some youth from the camp had scouted a large patch of farmland near an abandoned agri-tech facility. The building itself had been rumored to be heavily secured, but if there was anything left intact inside, a greenhouse, seeds and cold storage, battery banks, such a find could be an enormous boon. Danielle wanted Jana and Henry to join a team to investigate. She highlighted that Henry's curiosity and partial knowledge of old research led her to believe he might be able to interpret any technical instructions they found. Jana had proven adept at working in a group, physically pulling her weight and keeping her composure even under threat. They would accompany 4 others, including Alejandro, in the morning. The mission both excited and terrified Jana. She felt needed, yet aware that not everyone returned safely from these expeditions. Rising with the dawn, their group left the settlement behind. They trudged through damp fields, guided by rumors of the agri-tech facility's existence. The facility lay some 15 miles from Camp Once, an easy drive, now an arduous trek. The wind carried the scent of decaying vegetation, a sobering reminder of how quickly civilization structures deteriorated without maintenance. They waded through chest-high grass, circumvented abandoned roads with dilapidated vehicles, and occasionally startled wildlife. Jenna recalled reading that, after any major weather event or disaster, animals adapted quickly, sometimes reclaiming cities as their own. She wondered how many species now roamed freely, unaffected by the loss of electronics and oblivious to humanity's abrupt step backwards. At midday, they spotted a steel fence entwined with vines. Weather-beaten signage suggested this was indeed the Agritech compound. Alejandro motioned for them to halt, scanning for signs of human activity. The courtyard was cluttered with corroded vehicles and collapsed scaffolding. Rust reigned supreme. The facility's main structure loomed behind. Even from a distance, Jenna observed shattered windows, partially peeled roofing, and a mound of twisted metal near one side that looked like a collapsed radio tower. Following Henry's careful footfalls, they climbed through a gap in the fence, hearts pounding at every snap of twigs underfoot. Tension coiled in Jenna's stomach as they entered the interior yard. The building's doors were forced open, the lock crowbarred away. A hush settled over the group. Jenna tightened her hands around the wooden spear she carried, more of a staff than a true weapon. Henry unholstered his hatchet. Inside, the corridors were dark, though enough daylight spilled in through cracks in the wall to show scattered debris. Twisted wires hung from the ceiling, electrical cables turned to worthless strings by the solar storm. They cautiously advanced through the first hallway, stepping around broken glass. Here and there, something moved in the shadows, likely rodents. The air was stale, tainted with a faint scent of chemicals. If anything valuable remained, it might be in secure storage areas or labs deeper inside. At last, they came upon a locked door, labeled experimental greenhouse. It was still sealed, but corroded at the hinges. Alejandro tried the handle, no success. He waved them back and used a large crowbar. After several tense minutes, the metal gave way with a shriek that echoed. Sunlight spilled into the greenhouse from overhead skylights that had partially collapsed, letting in slanted beams of dusty light. Rows of withered plants peeked from broken hydroponic trays. The algae-like residue covering them suggested that, once upon a time, a high-tech system had managed the environment here. Henry pressed forward, scanning for anything that might still be salvageable: seeds, grow lights, nutrient formulas, or even research documents. Jenna noted that the flare's electromagnetic onslaught had likely ruined any stored digital data, but sometimes labs kept physical backups. They spread out, rummaging carefully. Most of the shelves held decomposed materials, but in a back room they discovered a locked steel cabinet. At first, it refused to open. Then, to everyone's surprise, the overhead light flickered, just once, and died. Alejandro stood stock still, uttering a soft curse. The building must have some backup battery or solar cells that were partially shielded. As hope soared, Henry found the cabinet key in a drawer. They swung the steel door open and discovered a sealed box of seeds, meticulously labeled and wrapped in vacuum packs. Some could be expired, but many might still germinate if they'd been properly stored. Their excitement soared further at the sight of a battered device in the corner. A metal casing labeled portable inverter. It was connected to a half-smashed battery bank behind the cabinet. Jolted by the possibility that it might still hold a charge, Henry stooped to inspect it, his trembling fingers carefully removing the cover. Inside, black scorch marks indicated partial damage but not a complete meltdown. If they could find or rebuild enough battery capacity, they might have a rudimentary power source for running minimal devices. Perhaps they could eventually power simple tools at night, or maybe a radio transmitter once they found a salvageable radio. "Let's load everything we can carry," Danielle said. Voice hushed but urgent. The group hurriedly gathered seeds, the battered inverter, and some old notebooks stuffed with formulas on hydroponic processes. Jana's mind swirled with possibilities. They might be stepping toward a chance to sustain larger yields of crops, maybe even begin re-establishing advanced agricultural techniques. Yet, looming in her thoughts was the knowledge that any working technology would be a beacon for those less willing to cooperate. Another settlement might be drawn to them, or even roving militias rumored to roam regions decimated by famine. In this new world, knowledge was precious, and so was brute force. On their way out, they heard footsteps echo somewhere behind them. The group froze. Alejandro gestured for them to extinguish all movement. Another crunch. Jana's pulse hammered. In a hushed motion, they slipped behind a half-fallen partition by the corridor. Through a hairline crack, Jana spotted two figures creeping into the greenhouse area, each carrying crude weapons. Their voices were too low to discern. From the tension in their posture, though, it was clear they were searching for something, perhaps the same resources Jana's group had just scavenged. She thought of the seeds in her pack, precious cargo that might tip the balance between survival and starvation for hundreds of people. She clenched her jaw, determined not to relinquish them. Unaware of the watchers in the corridor, the intruders disappeared into one of the back rooms. Without delay, Danielle motioned for a silent exodus. They retraced their steps down the hallway, stepping lightly. Every second felt drawn out. At last they emerged into the courtyard and slid through the fence gap. Jenna's exhalation caught in her throat. They had escaped unnoticed, but the adrenaline still coursed hot in her veins. The group traveled quickly for a full hour before stopping to catch their breath under a canopy of trees. Alejandro said quietly that if those strangers discovered what had been taken, or that they'd missed such an opportunity, they might pursue. They agreed to take a winding path back to camp, veering off main roads to avoid confrontation. Darkness fell as they entered the farmland near the settlement. A watchman spotted them, and shortly an eager crowd gathered to see what had been found. Danielle signaled for calm as Henry and Jana showed the battered inverter and the sealed seed packs. Handled with near reverence, the seeds and equipment were carried to a guarded section of the camp. They would inventory everything in the morning. Despite the danger, Jana couldn't contain the flicker of hope in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she saw the possibility of harnessing technology not just for short-term convenience, but to bolster their fragile civilization. Perhaps humanity's downfall wasn't total. Maybe they could adapt, weaving together the scraps of who they were with new, resilient methods. In the following days, the seeds were tested. Some were indeed too aged or had rotted from sporadic temperature fluctuations, but enough remained that the settlement's farmers believed they could revitalize multiple fields. The battered inverter was assigned to a small group of volunteer engineers and tinkerers, including Henry. They carefully deconstructed it, cataloging damaged parts, and resoldered what they could. This was a nerve-wracking process. If they made a mistake, the device might burn out for good. Quietly, Jana observed each attempt. She brought water and homemade bread to the group, anxious to see if it could spark even a small light bulb. On the third night, success struck in a subdued but momentous fashion. A dim bulb glowed, powered by a half-charged battery that had been scrounged from a defunct truck's starter. The entire settlement gathered around, breath caught in their throats, as meager light illuminated a circle of astonished faces. Some wept, reminded of how electricity had once been taken for granted. Others gazed in a mixture of excitement and fear, uncertain if the light might draw unwanted attention. For a few minutes, they dared to dream of a future where they could harness enough power to run a water pump or a shortwave radio, perhaps even re-establish contact with other pockets of survivors. When they turned the light off to conserve power, a hush followed, as if they had witnessed a miracle. Not everyone was thrilled. Whispers circulated about the risk of bandits or militias. One group within the camp, wary of any exposure, suggested burying or destroying all technology that could alert dangerous opportunists. But Danielle, with measured determination, insisted that they could use technology safely if they developed defenses. She reminded them that farming equipment alone was not enough to rebuild civilization. Humans needed knowledge, communication, and safer ways to gather water. The seeds they had found were a testament to how crucial knowledge was. Tools, responsibly used, might save lives. Inevitably, tensions flared one stormy night when the group that opposed technology confronted Danielle and her circle of engineers. Jana and Henry were present, anxiously watching as harsh words were exchanged in front of a half-built wooden fence that served as the settlement's perimeter. A voice from the opposing group claimed that this so-called progress was playing with fire, that forging rudimentary power grids would paint a target on all their backs. Henry calmly tried to respond, explaining that if they wanted to maintain even a modest population, they would need certain leaps forward. Or else disease, starvation, and harsh winters would claim them. Another man scoffed, decrying the attempt to reclaim the old ways as arrogance. Frightened mothers clutched their children, uncertain which side to support. A hushed heaviness fell over the settlement. Daniel, refusing to yield, gave an impassioned speech about how the real arrogance had been living in complacency before the solar storms, assuming that the convenience of technology would always be there. She argued for a new balance, mindful usage of what technology could be salvaged, guided by human cooperation rather than reckless consumption. The speech found echoes in many hearts. Although disagreements remained, the settlement as a whole decided to proceed with attempts to rebuild, but not at the cost of ignoring security. Patrols were doubled, walls were fortified, plans to create hidden bunkers for storing valuable equipment were laid. If any hostile group discovered them, they would not simply hand over their greatest assets. Jenna felt a renewed purpose. Once preoccupied with the menial tasks of data entry, she now discovered she had a knack for collaboration, organizing rosters, bridging differences, ensuring tasks were done efficiently. Henry thrived among the engineers, reconfiguring old wiring and studying any textbook he could scrounge. Each night, the settlement grew a little more confident. They tested a small radio circuit with the newly repaired inverter, hoping to pick up any signal, no matter how faint. The first nights brought only static. Then, in the second week after the greenhouse expedition, they discerned a faint voice speaking across a garbled signal. The camp froze in anticipation. Through distortion, they managed to pick up fragments. All non-perishable supplies needed. Near Lake Murr. Coordinate, farmland, safe passage, if. The audio fizzled, but it was enough to galvanize them. They were not alone. Some group, possibly near Lake Millfield or something with an M, was out there, broadcasting calls for aid and offering sanctuary. The settlement gathered to discuss the best course: move en masse to this new location, or send an envoy. In the end, they decided on an envoy. If a larger community existed, cooperation might accelerate reconstruction, so long as it was truly safe. Danielle volunteered Henry for the journey, confident in his diplomatic approach. Jana wrestled between wanting to go or remain. The settlement felt like home now, but she couldn't deny the pull of curiosity. A chance to see if society was reviving beyond these fields drew her like a magnet. Finally, after speaking with Henry and Danielle, she packed her belongings once again. She would join Henry and a few others on a trek to locate this rumored civilization near Lake Miss somewhere. Before leaving, they facilitated the distribution of seeds, ensuring the settlement's farmland would thrive, even if they couldn't return soon. They stashed the precious inverter in a secret underground chamber, leaving behind instructions for its care. As Jana watched the sun rise over the farmland, she felt something stirring in her heart. Fear still lurked in the corners of her mind, but it was accompanied by the faint echo of determination. They departed with a wave of farewells, carrying optimism and caution in equal measure. Along their path, Jana no longer sensed only doom. She noticed green shoots striving up through ash-laden soil, the resilience of life proving unstoppable. Her battered boots trod the earth with a purposeful stride. She glanced over at Henry, who offered a small, reassuring smile. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, whether Lake M would turn out to be a fable, a stronghold, or a threat. They walked with measured hopes, fueled by the faith that if they managed to find others cultivating a new way of life, perhaps humanity's darkest hour could also be the seed of its rebirth. In the distance, the sky was an endless stretch of cerulean. The memory of cosmic flares burning the heavens was still fresh, but for now, the sun cast warmth rather than fury. Maybe, Jana thought, the same powerful star that destroyed so much could yet nourish their future crops, lighting the path to a world they would rebuild with careful hands and newly forged ideals. Their footsteps drew them onward through farmland, across broken roads, out beyond reach of the camp. Though fragile, their hope beat with each heartbeat, forging a tentative manifesto that the greatest power of humankind lay not in the devices it could build, but in the spirit that could rise after losing everything.